Hello everyone, welcome back to Conquering Your Financial Future. My name's Gavin Glozier, I'm a director of Your Wealth Hub. Thanks for listening to our next podcast. I'm here today and very impressed to be here with Russell Collins from Risk Insurance Communication Skills. Welcome along, Russ.
Thank you.
And Russ, am I right in saying this is your first podcast you've been...
Very first.
Are you excited to be here today?
Oh, very excited, yeah.
Russ and I have been talking a lot about today, and in Russ's excitement, said he couldn't sleep very well last night. He was absolutely anticipating today. So we will kick off, Russ. And one of the highlights of my day is obviously talking to you, but talking about, I suppose, a bit of history around your career in the financial services industry, and in specifically helping many people over many years. And I want to dive into a bit of your rich history that's been able to bring together so many great stories of being able to help numerous people. So one of the questions that I had at the tip of my tongue, and has been present for a long time in working with yourself, Russ, is you've been able to help a lot of people over the years. And when we've talked about issues that people have faced over the years, do you feel very much now there's a clear difference between when you started your career in the early 70s to now around the issues that people face?
No, frankly, if we pick one area that might be the topic of discussion, is financial literacy. In the era that I grew up with, first of all, in my family, my siblings and I were children of the Great Depression. So whilst that might not be applicable to a lot of people today, I was born during World War II, as were my siblings, and what we did as we grew up, our age demographic then inherited from the children of the Great Depression the values, work ethic that were applicable at that point in time. So being the children of the children, one of the things that as soon as you leave school, for example, the first thing you did was go and open up a bank account, like a savings account. And the idea was that out of your pay each week, you would take an amount of money and put it into the bank account. In those days, you're working during the day, the banks were open on Saturdays. So you go down to the local bank with your passbook, you put 10 shillings or whatever it was, they stamp it, put it in, and you had it accumulated. And the point I'm making here is that in those days, there was still, what we did was we saved first and spent what was left. But then, so that's like 1955, 56 onwards. But then in 1971, when I came into the financial services industry, what I found was that there are two types of people in the workforce. There are those that spend and save what's left, and there are those that save and spend what's left. So my demographic was the save and spend what's left. What I found in the 70s, for example, there were a majority of people would spend and then save what was left. In fact, I would say out of all the people I met, I'd be lucky to find 5% who saved before they spent. And that was one of the big differences. And I think that comes down to financial literacy.
And if that was present in the 1970s, in your last years as a financial advisor, did you see that those two principles were present, and what was the rough split? Roughly, you could kind of share with us.
Well, I would say roughly 5%. What I'm saying was that if you take my age demographic, so after World War II, for example, like Australia got back off its knees, and then with our children, and families started to prosper and so like that. So our children, for example, our children's demographic, what I found was that they were choosing lifestyle, so I'm going to the 80s now, over what I would call common sense. It was common sense to me. But where on weekends they could spend hundreds of dollars on entertainment and things like that, and then when it come to buying a house or something, they didn't have enough money for the deposit. So that principle, I would say, just to let you know, in my professional life, one of the questions I would ask people is saving money a problem? So I'm talking to adult people with children, so on. And quite often, the answer was, they tap dance around the answer, like about, well, we overpay our mortgage, we do this, that. But I would cut to the chase and say, okay, if you saved as much money in the next 5 years as you did in the last 5 years, would you be comfortable with it? And they would all say no. So even I'm talking to adults, but you get to then to bring up the subject of budgeting and things like this. And actually, all of this is a discipline. You've got to make the decision what you want to do, decide what you want to do, decide how you're going to do it, and then do it. That was the plan.
Well, that financial literacy point is still an area of contention. You know, our business through your Wealth Hub focuses on financial wellness, and it focuses on teaching people the basics, the 101 of money. From what we've seen and what you're saying, it still hasn't been a case that financial literacy piece is being taught in schools. People receive paychecks and they're not equipped with the tools or a sense to be able to understand what to do with that. Would you say that's a consistent theme as well?
Absolutely. You just go back to the school days, like if late teenagers, for example, they've left school, if they buy a car, for example, they wouldn't think of driving the car out without getting it insured. So things like, you know, car insurance, house insurance, people insure their jewellery, people insure their golf sticks. But what they weren't taught at school was that your most valuable asset the most valuable asset you could insure is your ability to earn income. Because cars, houses, jewellery, golf sticks, they can all be replaced. You can't replace your ability to earn income. And I think in the schools, if they could learn this thing, that's the most valuable asset is your ability to earn income. And then if they were taught at the same time, well, there's only two sources of income when you go to work. There's what you earn from your self-exertion, and there's what you earn like from capital investment. So how do you start to invest in a capital investment, whether it's a piece of property or whatever? You have to start first. And so they should draw a circle, like if you draw a circle here that says income, and draw a circle here that says bank. And then you've got to go to there with a big circle here that says investments. So you go from income to bank, let it accumulate in the bank, and then transfer it into an investment. Some people borrow and go into investment. Well, if the investment doesn't work out, they've lost, they're paying off the debt at the one time, and they've lost whatever gain they might get out of the investment.
It's all out of kilter.
Correct.
I think there is this sense of kind of instant gratification that's certainly come to the forefront now, where people are having a greater focus on satisfying their insatiate need now to have a holiday, to go out for a lovely restaurant. It's all a credit-driven culture. Do you think the credit-driven culture has been something that you've seen change over the years?
Absolutely. I can't I can't understand why the banks would give people credit facilities that they'll never be able to repay. And the sad thing is that in giving them this credit facility, which might be to help them to get into an investment property or something like this, quite often their parents come in as guarantors. And so if the debt can't be paid, where there's redundancy or something like that, who does the debt fall upon? And they don't.
It's the parents.
Correct.
Yeah.
And we've got parents in our area where I live, 20, 30 years ago, I can remember them saying, because the value of the house had gone up so much, that the real estate advisor was saying to the young people, well, get your parents to help you out. So their parents are mortgaging their house against this debt.
Yeah.
And I just think that it goes on today. I saw something in the paper about it the other day, but I still think you should save first and then spend what's left.
Absolutely.
Right.
I think the as I said, there is now this instant gratification piece, and I think when you've got that middle layer of baby boomers, post-baby boomers, pre-baby boomers entering retirement, they're looking now at a very competitive space for moving their parents into an aged care facility. There isn't a lot of facilities around, so it makes it really hard. And the children, your generation and younger, are bearing the brunt on managing that transition. But they've also got their own children that are obviously kind of getting themselves deep into debt as well. So so back to your first point there, I think definitely the saving principles.
But I agree with that. And with the aged care facilities, with medical science, it's inevitable that when I came in the industry in 1970, the life expectancy of the male and female was 73 and 76 respectively. In 2018, it's 80 and 83. So that's in one generation. So what will it be like these people in their 20s and 30s? What's it going to be in the next generation? We're going to live till we're 90 or whatever. Maybe not in the best of dementia helped, but anyway, yeah.
Well, that's the reality, isn't it?
It is. It's the
People
reality.
are living longer.
Correct.
So they will need to manage their money better earlier.
Correct.
And I know something that we've always advocated for, and all the people that we speak to through our podcasts, the earlier you get to managing your money, the better off you're going to be long term. So I suppose that kind of begs me to ask the second question that I want to ask you about. People who have seen you in the early days and perhaps have been or had been clients for 20 or 30 years would have benefited early on from your advice versus people who come to you late in their life. Do you think there's a distinct difference between people who engage early? And it's a bit of a loaded question. I know what you're going to say here, but is there a distinct difference between people who engage at a much younger age than people who engage just before their retirement?
Of course. And the short answer to that is come back to the school, financial literacy. What should be taught at school, it is in mathematics but not in financial literacy, is the principle of compound interest. So it doesn't, like if you start saving your retirement at 20, you're going to have more money in your retirement than the person who's 40.
Yeah.
But today, with a two-income family, large mortgages and education and so like this, as I was moving towards the end of my career as an advisor, I'm meeting people that they get married late. Like my wife and I were married at 21, which was the thing back in those days. But now you've got, they may be starting their families at 35 or even 40. Well, if they're going to have 3 children and now they're 45, that means with a mortgage and education, they're going to be like 60 before they're going to be freed up. And all of a sudden they meet with a financial planner who says, what do you want? They say, well, this is what I want. They say, well, you've run out of time. Well, you can't wind back the clock. You can't unring the bell. It's already been done.
Yeah.
So I make your point. The earlier that you can start on it and understand the principle of compound interest, I really don't think that people, maybe I'm wrong, financial planners, when they get these young people, I think you should get them into a savings plan rather than investment. Like I said, go from income to bank to investments.
Yeah.
And then if they have all these people, these advisors that have got these savings accounts going, they've also built themselves a huge clientele, like they're warehousing all these people for future to develop.
But I think that's probably the most basic savings principle of all. We'll come back to it a little bit later, talking about the behaviours of saving and having smart money skills.
Yeah.
In probably the late 70s, early 80s, we started to see superannuation become more of a topical conversation. It wasn't yet compulsory, but there was a distinct kind of segment of the community that were putting money away, but although it wasn't a mandatory space then. What was the sentiment towards superannuation before 94 when it came in as compulsory?
Well, that's a good question, because I'm old enough to remember this, that in 1983, the Hawke-Keating government, when Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister, and he came out of the ACTU, so he was anti-employers and sort of that. I'm just saying this because he led the ACTU against all the big. But when he came in here, he realised that let's say in various industries where they were unionised, that the employers and the unions had to get along well together. So he called them all in to Parliament House, and he invented a thing, introduced it called the Accord. And what that meant was that the employers and the unions agreed to get along with each other. That was the first part. So they weren't going to fight each other because you could delay everything. So he said, okay, what's the basis for this relationship? So this is only at the unionised area. So the employers agreed, this is about 1983, to provide a 3% salary increase immediums to the employees, but it didn't go to them, it went into a superannuation fund, which obviously the unions managed. So that became a sort of a norm, and interesting it was Bob Hawke's thought or not, but it became like the topic, and then finally, so all the people that had superannuation even before 1983, and certainly before 1992 when it was introduced, that in 1983, the banks, the public service, the huge corporations, like all these government, they were the only ones that had superannuation.
And was it seen that the right thing to do was to work with a company that had that plan because it was something people valued at the time, or was it still kind of off in the on the ether as something not to worry about because it was such a long time away?
Well, the answer to that is both, and again it goes back to your parents. Because my father was a victim of the Depression, what he made, we had 2 boys and 2 girls, but he said, when my sons start work, just before I knew anything, I'll make sure they get a job in the public service or the banks, because that's where the security will be when the next Great Depression comes. And by the way, they also got superannuation, which my father didn't have at the time. So that's why I joined the public service, and I was in there for 15 years. But when this Accord thing started, it created momentum. And so the pressure became, and then Paul Keating introduced it in 1992, if I remember correctly, and it started off at 3%, and it was going to rise to 12% by about 2022, something like that. It's got stalled at 9.5% at the moment because the employers can't afford much more, whatever the situation is. But it became, were people thinking about it? I don't think they thought about it as much as when they saw the Accord in action. And that's where I think the momentum came, with the public saying, well, what about us? Like, do I go back, I don't want to join the public service, I don't want to join a bank, right? I don't want to join a great big corporation. What about where I am now? And so I think that was smart thinking on Hawke and Keating, and they introduced it.
So when it came in 94, was it almost a sense of relief because there was so much time, people talking about the Accord, and when superannuation came into fruition, government brought to legislation so it was mandatory. People had a portion of their earnings set aside for retirement. Was there a sense of relief because it was going to take care of itself, or was there always an expectation that you did need to put more aside? What was the sentiment?
No, that's a good question. I would say that the majority of people before, like the Accord before went on, they were too busy paying off mortgages and raising kids. Like, retirement was a million light years away, so it wasn't a priority. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't on their minds, but as they started to do this, these people where it wasn't on their minds, now it became on their minds, because they started to see this could be the answer to my superannuation. Because how else am I going to retire on? In those days, it was just the old age pension. Centrelink wasn't nearly doing what it's doing today. So it was a mental thing, but the people who weren't interested when it was introduced were the people who were still single, or who thought, well, I can do better than superannuation or something like that.
Which is not too dissimilar to today.
No.
Because a lot of people who are still young, they don't see superannuation as a meaningful benefit that their employer actually provides. So keep in mind that when superannuation did come in, it was during the same kind of period as the recession that we had to have.
Correct.
Interest rates were up to 17, 18, 19% in some instances. So this was a big chunk of money.
Think of the pressure on the employers.
Correct.
Because I was an employer then.
Yeah.
And there were many times rather, I should say, my wife was in the business with me, where the staff were paid and the superannuation was paid before we got paid. And that was the hard thing. Like, all of a sudden, you've got to find 3% for everybody in there. And then it was going to go up like 0.5%, right up to 12%. I mean, you just thought, how are we ever going to do this?
Yeah.
I mean, you managed, but at the time, but did the staff appreciate it? I would say one age demographic did.
Yeah.
The other age demographic, I'm talking about the Gen X and Gen Y and all of that, it was a million light years away. And I think that's a big mistake.
Yeah, and I think that's still the case now. I think you still get people who are in touch with their superannuation. I think the fact that people are now electing to make choice based on their risk tolerance, people are taking a vested interest in their own super, because it does form a large part of their package these days. If you're on $100,000, you've got $9,500 that's being put away year on year end. And you talked about compound interest before. People are seeing, particularly in good times, we're just at we're coming up to our 10th year of uninterrupted growth in the Australian market. We're seeing good year-on-year growth on our supers. So for people who are on, decent money, they're seeing large chunks from little things, big things grow. As we know, that the song from Paul Kelly, it's been used in various industry fund ads. That's exactly the case, and superannuation is a great example of that. One of the things that we like to try to do is to share the benefits of super, so people do start to become aware of their own space.
Well, like I say, that's interesting, because after it was underway, so let's say around the year 2000, I would visit people, or they'd come in my office and they'd I'd ask them to bring in their superannuation statement. And I'd say, how often do you review this? I don't understand it. And so you'd sit down with them, and so it wasn't 9.5% then, but ultimately I'd say to them, I think you should understand this.
Yeah.
Because if somebody is taking 4 or 5 or 6% of your salary out and putting it over there, if you're going to rely on that for retirement, you better understand where it's going. You better know a little bit more about it.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways I was giving business back to the superannuation fund people, but educating them about, hey, you better pay attention to this.
Yeah, and that literacy space is so important for people young and old. It's about taking control, taking an interest. So,
well, I'll just say this then on that basis. Because for most of them, I'd say over 90% of them, that's going to be the biggest asset they'll have at retirement.
Outside your family home.
Correct.
Absolutely. And it still is for many, many people.
Yeah.
We do talk about, we talked before, we caught up before this session today, we talked about your biggest asset leading into retirement is largely depending on when you start. Taking note, it's your ability to earn income.
Correct.
And that in itself is your huge asset. So obviously we talk about insurance and the ability to insure yourself so you don't lose that big asset as well.
Correct.
Over the years you would have seen some ups and downs with a lot of clients. People who have gone through some prosperous times and people who've fallen hard times. Getting them to stay focused on their plans to make sure they can still continue to deliver on their goals must be hard. What type of tips did you have for people to make them continue to focus?
Well, I can only talk about the insurance side, so that when that happened, like when people made redundant or whatever, or there were times when people would ring me up, for example, and say, no, let me back. I would get an overdue premium notice or a policy in danger of lapsing. I would initiate the follow-up. So I'd get my staff to give me their file, look at their insurances or whatever, and particularly the file note that related to the insurance that's in danger, go back to them. And sometimes they'd say, I've been made redundant, or other times they'd say, look, the premium's gone up, like it's going up each year. To be honest with you, I'm glad you rang because I'm thinking whether I want to keep this going or not. So the important thing in that situation, I'll talk about the other one in a second, was for me to say, like to talk to them and hear what they had to say. So I would go back and say, let's look at why you took the insurance out in the first place. And they would say, was that risk still there? And that they would be reminded of it. And then they would see it was necessary to keep it going and they'd find the money. Now, if it was a situation where they didn't have any money at all, then I would still try and say to them, well, let's sit down, like there's a panic situation comes in if you get made redundant. I remember once a chap had been made redundant, he came around to my place that night. He knocked on the door. Can I talk to you? Like he was so let's sit down and talk about what it is. And sometimes it's not as bad a problem as what they've got. They do have some savings, they do have this. And for all they know, they could get another job in a week's time. But you've got to, if you're understanding financial literacy, you've got to understand where they're at the moment, what were their goals, and what they were doing was heading them towards their goals.
And that all keeps them in line with their goals.
Correct. Why do you want to get here?
Yeah.
And how are you going to get there? Now, what has happened that this has happened? So then you have to listen to what they're doing and then try and help them walk through it. Don't just say, well, look, sorry to hear that, but when you get yourself back on your feet, give me a call. I mean, your role as an advisor is to serve, not be served.
Yep.
So you've got to try and find an answer to their problems.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very important in this environment as well that the people that you are seeing are focusing on your needs, because that's certainly the case at the moment. We're hearing a lot of media around that.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important.
Yeah.
So Russ, look, I want to kind of wrap up just quickly, and as I said, I wanted to dive into your background and talk about your rich history and how you've been able to help many people over the years and share and impart some of your knowledge onto the people that are listening to our podcast. I love what you talked about up front around financial literacy is the key. It's having the basic behaviours down pat, being able to save first and spend after savings, which enables you to then generate your own wealth down the track. The behaviours of money are really, really important. Do you have any other tips that you want to share with us around things that are important to you that you think people would want to use in their financial world?
Well, if I was talking to somebody at that basic level here, what I draw a circle and I put in their investments there.
Yep.
I draw a circle here and I put income. I draw a circle there and put bank. And I draw a circle over there and put insurance. And over here, I would draw another circle and put superannuation. And I would say to people, all you've got to do to get accumulation and superannuation is to turn up and breathe, because 9.5% of your money's going there, but you better understand 100% of the 9.5%, which they're not. But to get them into something like, say, extra superannuation or whatever, to talk to them about the importance of budgeting and try and go through their work and try and get them, like, I think that the bank, in those days, it used to be the most important financial vehicle that you had, but people don't save anymore. But if they could adopt a discipline where they are saving, and then you accumulate money in there, and then once that's accumulated, let's assume you've got $10,000 in there, then put $5,000 into an investment. So in those days, the investments was just like the money, like the share market and bonds. Over here was property, down here was risk, like the commodities, and over here was the superannuation here. So as I said, that's just going to grow by just having your money go in there. So if you invest, then at the time of retirement, you've got these investments, whatever they might be, plus the superannuation. This has been provided by your employer, but by the same token, you should have paid attention to it. This has been provided by you, so 1 + 1 = 2 on that basis there.
And for people who are listening to our podcast, what I'll do is I'll make a link to the drawing that Russ has just described and articulated for us. So, look, Russ, I really appreciate your time today. I've learned a lot about the background and understanding kind of what's happened over the years. And the overwhelming kind of message for me is financial wellness and financial literacy is so important to everyone.
Correct.
Even today, is as important as it was back in the 70s.
Nothing has changed, and in fact, it can't change. I think in the future, it'll still be a principle.
Yeah, great. Russ, thanks for coming on to Conquering Your Financial Future. Really appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Gavin.
Terrific.